I have a question, similar questions from a Susan and a Kari. So I'm going to kind of mix them all together because they're kind of in the same field here. The first Susan writes, I do not understand the saying that everything goes through Jesus first. I had a teaching this weekend that talked about Christ being the door and everything that gets to us has to come over him because we're his flock and so on and so forth. She continues, my son suffered a terrible illness for 7 years and committed suicide in 2000. Listen, before I go on, I am so sorry. I've always felt that the Lord welcomed him home and that he wept with me. I would find it very difficult to affirm that the Lord wished for my son to suffer as he did for any reason. I do not believe that good comes out of, I do believe that good comes out of all things, and I have felt the Lord's presence throughout my life. Then another Susan had written in basically the same thing. How could God, you say that this has to pass through God, and she had gone through several heartbreaking miscarriages. And then Kari has also gone through a very difficult time. And she added, how can I explain this to a non-believer? Well, first of all, let me say this. Thank you for this catch. This is a very good distinction to make. And I was way too simplistic in the way that I put that in my sermon. I'm very sorry for that. And I'm very grateful for a chance to help clarify what I was trying to say. Obviously, what God permits is not always what God would intend. And let me pause here and just say, in the Hebrew understanding of things in the Old Testament, and for many Jews in the New Testament, it doesn't make a differentiation between primary and secondary causation. That is, it doesn't make a difference between what God instigate and what God allows. But that's a very important distinction. Evil is, what I'm trying to say is that many things that happen to us are not things God would intend. It's simply what God would permit. And if somehow I conveyed that God is the author of evil or is callous when we suffer, I'm just so sorry for that. That's not what I intended. Evil is the perversion of good that God intends for us, and he wants us to be close to him as we walk through it. He wants to help us through it. What I was trying to say is that God is not absent or helpless or surprised during the most difficult times of our lives, and that he intends to bring a greater good out of what he allowed to happen. If there is evil in the world, and there is, then somehow the sovereign God not only allows it, but has a purpose in it. As you may know, my son too committed suicide, even though he very much believed in God and very much trusted in Christ for his salvation. I too am sure that he is with God now. Yet what happened could not escape God's notice and care. Psalm 23 says, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, thou art with me. So here's what we have to understand, that given free will, we will go off course. And we will do things that God would never want us to do, God would never intend for us to do. And he allows it to happen only because there is some greater purpose that he will work out of it. And since my own son's death, I've often thought of how much worse could have happened. And maybe he foresaw that. I don't know. I just know that God wasn't absent for a second through the whole thing. And even though there isn't a day that goes by that I don't miss him, I know that God will superintend good and that someday I'll be with him again. Now, as to Kari's follow-up question, how can I explain this to a non-believer? Let me just simply say you probably can't, because what we're saying requires faith. And faith means that you can't always reason it out or justify it or understand it. It just means that you trust God for it. And so the only illustration I've ever heard that may make sense to a non-believer is, so somebody talked about going into a rug factory one time, and they saw a rug in the making, and they saw the underside of the rug, and there was just all of these strings hanging down. It just looked like pure chaos. It just looked like awful. It was all tangled and just unsightly. But then they turned the loom over. They turned the or whatever that's called, the thing that holds the rug. They turned it over, and you saw the top side of the rug, and it was beautiful, intricate design of what was actually being woven. I think that down here we see in a mirror dimly. We see the underside of the rug, and we don't understand. But we've got to have faith. That there is someone who is weaving our lives together in a way that ultimately, when we get into heaven, we'll see the top side, and it was a beautiful pattern.